Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And continuing on with my Booker Prize shortlist project thing, I'm looking at 1990, and I sort of had held off from reading the last book from this one here, Amongst Women by John McGahern, for a really long time, and have finally done so. So let's talk a little bit about this shortlist. I'm going to go through talking about the books as we go, and apologies in advance, I'm very sweaty because it is very, very warm. I almost did this entire thing in a vest top, and then it just figured it was just too much. Anyway, let's get talking about these books. So starting with our winner, we have A.S. Byatt with Possession. And this is a book that has gone on for many people to be one of their favourites from the Booker winners. It's a very big, epic book that goes through a large number of sort of little rabbit holes and various other plot points. But essentially what it starts off at as is these two academics in the modern day time who are going back through the various history of some people in literature and are particularly trying to uncover what's going on. And in typical A.S. Byatt fashion, what starts as a seemingly academic and kind of abstract idea for the book soon goes into something a little bit deeper and more personal. And so what we start to get is these two people, as they are doing this, starting to mirror the very affair that they are writing about. And it's interesting in this that the book has the subtitle A Romance, so Possession, a Romance. And in many ways that comes through really strongly in this book. But I think that also is just something, I think there's more to it than that. This book has this really luscious, gorgeous prose. Because it's written about poetry and academia, it also starts to mirror that language itself as well, which I think is really quite beautiful. It's a really, it's a big book compared to some of the others on this list, I think, but is also just a really tender and thoughtful and beautiful one, but also quite funny. And it was interesting when A.S. Byatt passed away, I think last year, I think it might have been, a lot of people started talking about, you know, how much her work has meant to them, particularly this book, as just being an introduction to a type of writing that is somewhat different and new. And often when we talk about Booker Prize winners, the interesting thing for me, at least, is that they tend to be distinctive in some way. So even if there are other books in the shortlist that other people maybe prefer, a winning book tends to have that little extra quality of something a bit newer or a bit different that stands out. And this book definitely does that on this list. Next up, we have An Awfully Big Adventure by Beryl Bainbridge. And Beryl is an author who I really love. And this shortlist in many ways is a bit of a who's who of authors who have been nominated several times. And Beryl Bainbridge, her writing I always find very fun and insightful and often quite silly and quite funny, but often with something much darker going on underneath. And this book is especially true to that. The core idea of the book is that it is talking about a set of actors who are producing or kind of coming together to make the show, and the show is Peter Pan. And so you've got a lot of, you know, this is a more childlike or more children-focused show, but what we learn about the adults taking part in this is that they are doing anything but being sort of childlike or whatever. There is a lot of this kind of background drama of what's going on, of people sleeping with each other and falling out and all of these things going on. And the book is wonderfully chaotic with all of these people just being awful to each other. And whereas that, although that doesn't immediately sound like it'd be a lot of fun for a book, there is something about the way that Beryl Bainbridge, I think, creates characters that I found really captivating in this, because they are allowed to be these really messy, awful, terrible people at times, and there's also a redemptive feature. But without spoiling anything, this book builds towards an end that is a genuine cliffhanger, what the hell just happened kind of moment, for me at least, where something is revealed about some of the characters and how they are linked to each other, that changes so much of the direction of the book. And it makes this whole book also just feel incredibly dark and tricky and complicated, and I loved it for that. It's so funny to watch a group of who are ostensibly some younger characters, some slightly older characters, all trying to come together in this messy, chaotic blur to create a show. And then for something bigger than the show to interrupt the whole thing. So I think this is so wonderfully astute and well done. And next up, another author who is no stranger to a Booker shortlist and was a winner herself, Penelope Fitzgerald with The Gate of Angels. And I love her work anyway. I think she's remarkably fun. And this is a book that really especially feels like that to me. So the core idea, there are two people around a university, I think it's Cambridge. They collide on bikes. And what then happens is we see a fallout of them trying to have some kind of relationship in some ways together. And we soon learn how complicated that is, because many people in this relationship, well, the two people in this situation where they wake up in a hospital and are forced to essentially interact with each other, have very, very different views of how their lives are now intertwined. For one person, he thinks that this means that they are forever bound and this is the deepest relationship that they're ever going to have. For her, she feels slightly less assured of that fact. And so what then ends up happening is this book that is partly this absurd relationship or absurd kind of point of view from particularly this guy, and a wider conversation where he is sort of pontificating around philosophy and science and all of these other things, and all of the reasons how that is a sign that they need to be together, and indeed it is not. And I love this about Penelope Fitzgerald's writing. She's so able, I think, to get under the skin of something like this, find the absurdity, find the pathos and the horror and the drama, but also the fun of this, that this is an absurd situation that just continues to get weirder and weirder for some of the characters involved. I love her as a writer. I think she's so funny, so astute, and like Beryl, Bainbridge, there's just something magic about the quality of the stories they create. Next up, we have Amongst Women by John McGahern. And this is a novel that Greg over at Supposedly Fun really greatly enjoyed, and Margaret Atwood at one point referred to as being a perfect novel. And I really greatly enjoyed this book. I think it does some really intelligent things in a really profound and personal way. And this is a very short list. These are some very short books on this list. And in about 200 pages, probably even less than that, I think, this book does quite a lot. So we have a character at the heart of this book, a man called Michael Moran, and he is in many ways trapped in history, and particularly the history around the Irish War of Independence. And he is now in the more modern day of this book, so sort of, this was the 1990 prize, and he is trying to understand where he is in that moment. And what that really means in many ways is that you've got somebody deeply trapped by a very, very rapidly changing society in Ireland. And he occupies this really strange place because he's essentially from a very different time and still in many ways fighting some of the same fights from then, but everybody else around him does not fully understand. And without spoiling anything about how this book builds, we slowly come more and more to realize how he is struggling with the current day, and particularly how when it comes to sort of his final days, how he will then potentially be remembered, how the family will deal with a situation where somebody from a time is passing, because it almost feels like the death of that time as well. And so in doing so, in losing the last people who were around in a specific period of time, what does that mean for a modern day Ireland? And in many ways, the next book I'm going to talk about really goes into this as well. So it's interesting to see both of these on the shortlist. And I think a book that's so tender and spare in the way that it builds towards what it's doing, that I think is so clever and subtle in its ferocity. Next up, and like I mentioned, a book that sits very comfortably and sort of uncomfortably in many ways alongside Amongst Women, we have Lies of Silence by Brian Moore. And this is a book that I found really deeply compelling for several reasons. It in many ways reads like a sort of, not even spy, but kind of thriller book, but in a way that is really horrific. So this book is set around the time of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and this man who we have at the heart of the book, Michael Dillon, has essentially been told that, I don't want to spoil too much of this, he has a choice to make that will essentially potentially either upend his family and his own life, or will lead to some other further destruction. Without spoiling too much, he is essentially told that he has to be in charge of a bomb going off. And essentially, there's an impossible decision at the heart of this of who he chooses who will die. Within that being either, essentially, it's the trolley problem, right? It's either somebody he loves, or it is somebody, it's sort of other people, a sort of set of innocents in this. And he has to try to work out what to do. He can't tell anybody anything. And essentially in doing so, he opens himself up to whatever happens will be awful. He knows that he'll have to live with the guilt of whatever happens, and he will never be able to forgive himself. And the other set of people will at some point know that the decision he made, or it may eventually come out. And this all comes up. And so we are following him in the book as he is trying to work out what to do. And essentially it's a hostage situation almost, that he has to make a decision, or else he will also lose his life and other things will go wrong as well. And so this impossible decision is placed in front of him. But this book just keeps railroading him into further and further complications. And it feels almost Kafkaesque towards the end, because it's just unrelenting with how difficult this choice will have to be for him. I found it really deeply affecting. And I read it a second time, again, as part of reading these shortlists. And just as much the second time, this book is a gut punch. It is just impossible at times to think about how this character would be feeling. But also there's something so unnerving, because we also know that this book is passing commentary on a real situation. It's passing commentary on the Troubles. This is not a sort of a situation like Speed, the film, where it's sort of more hypothetical. This is something real. And I think this book is so unflinching. And there's another book by Brian Moore that was shortlisted for another year, which is, I think, incredible as well for its ability to focus in on characters making awful decisions and having to stand by the most impossible decisions at times. Yeah, I think this is brilliant. It's so affecting for me personally, and I think this is it's a tough book, but a really essential one, I think, at the same time. So finally, we have Mordecai Richler with Solomon Gursky Was Here. And this is a book that I struggled with, I will admit, from this list, but I also see why people really like it. I struggle generally with comedy books, or kind of books that are meant to be funny. Partly, sometimes those really land for me, but I think, you know, Terry Pratchett, for example, that really lands for me. But I think sometimes I find that quite funny books can kind of grate on me after a while. And this is quite a long book, so I think it kind of grated on me for a longer period of time. But anyway, the core idea of this is that there is a man called Moses who has been following this Gursky family for a while and wants to write a biography about their lives rather. And he, in doing so, becomes further and further obsessed with little details about their lives, and particularly about this one person, Solomon Gursky. And so what follows is this book that is in some ways quite tragic, because Moses now is this man who is not enjoying life. He's struggling with various demons. He is addicted to alcohol. He's really struggling with many other things going on in his life. And so this sort of thing that he's holding on to is this family. This is his obsession. This is the thing that allows him to get up out of bed in the morning and write and be part of all of this. But this obsession is also a dangerous thing, because it's the only real thing that is vaguely normal in his life, and even then it's quite obscure. And so other people around him are increasingly, confused and isolated from what he's doing. But what then follows is he really wants to go into their life and to understand this, and particularly this character of Solomon Gursky, who has this potted and odd history where he is believed to have died in a plane crash, but then there are all these other factors of, did this really happen? Almost, if you imagine a kind of Elvis, did he really die kind of style thing. And that's the level of kind of obsession that we see from Moses in this book. And there's quite a lot in here that I thought was also interesting about him, about sort of, there's a Jewish connection between these two men. They are both these Canadian men trying to kind of, so he sees something of himself in Solomon Gursky, which makes the whole thing a bit more tragic as well, because he is trying to unearth something about this person's life, but Moses himself is probably destined to die relatively nameless and kind of, not somebody who would himself have a biography written about him. Although this novel then almost feels like a stand-in for that, where we're kind of watching him being written about. But there's something about that, about this sort of tragedy that he has spent his whole life obsessed with his family, and actually it may turn out that he doesn't want to necessarily understand the truth of it all. But it's a wild book, and particularly interesting as well, looking at the shortlist from this time, that this is the only person from outside the UK and Ireland on this shortlist. And that's very much typical of the time where, it was just the Commonwealth who were eligible for this. So it's intriguing to wonder what would have happened if American authors in the 90s, or people from anywhere else in the world, would have been allowed in for this as well. But anyway, I struggled with this. I found it overly long, but I get the appeal of it. I just really struggle with comic novels like this. But I think there is a really beautiful amount of pathos and tragedy in this book at the same time. So those are the 6 books that were shortlisted for this year's prize. And I find it really interesting looking back at old shortlists and also trying to imagine or think about what other books would have been big at the time. But even so, looking at these 6 books, there is a common thread of a line in here. There's something about the way we write about people of the past and how we remember the past that comes through quite strongly. So Possession and Lies of Silence, Solomon Gursky was here, all have this sense of focus on how we tell stories, who we remember and how. And then same for Amongst Women as well. And I find something quite interesting about looking at this list altogether is this sense of how history is remembered, how we talk about history, how we think about it, and how two people, like in The Gate of Angels, can have very different readings of the same story. In something like An Awfully Big Adventure by Beryl Bainbridge, there's also a complicating factor of what we do and don't know. So these 6 books do thread together really interestingly. And I can see why actually from these Possession wins, because it is a book that in many ways does what some of these other books do thematically in terms of writing about history and looking back, but also has this very literary bent to it. It's this big sweeping epic of a book. It's very beautifully written and sumptuously written. I think if I were choosing my own personal favourites, it may be clear from what I've been saying here, but An Awfully Big Adventure by Beryl Bainbridge I think would be up there. I think it's fantastic. The Gate of Angels by Penelope Fitzgerald or Lies of Silence by Brian Moore would be my top 3. But I think these are a really fantastic set of novels, and even though I didn't get on with Solomon Gursky Was Here, there is a lot I can appreciate about how it is structured and written, and the kind of humour of that, even if the humour doesn't work for me. But I think this is a really interesting shortlist to look back on, and one where apart from A.S. Byatt's book, I don't know how well these other books are actually known. So it's interesting to go back over them. Again, these are books I probably wouldn't have necessarily checked out outside of the shortlist. But I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of them. Do check them out if any of them sound interesting. I think Lies of Silence would probably be, I don't know, it's a good top 3, I think, of Penelope Fitzgerald, Brian Moore and Beryl Bainbridge. I think all of them are such fascinating character studies in really different ways. And all very, very detailed and interesting. So yeah, do check them out if they sound interesting to you. I'm slowly getting further and further through my Booker prize project. There's a plane or helicopter going off somewhere nearby. But either way, I hope you are having a fantastic week or reading time or whatever you're doing. And yes, continuing on with this project, we're slowly getting towards the end, which is terrifying.